Grand Rounds, thanks for being here this morning. Today's Grand Rounds is a special named lectureship. It's the Julia Berg Memorial Lecture, and I'd like to tell you a few things about Julia and the basis for this lectureship before I turn it over to one of our colleagues to introduce our speaker. Julia Berg was 15 in the year 2005 and was about to begin her sophomore year at Southwest High School here in Minneapolis. She was a swimmer, she was in the International Baccalaureate program, and she had an internship at the Sierra Club. She enjoyed spending time with her friends, and at the time wrote a list of 40 what she called words to remember in 2005, among them truth, compassion, love, peace, and chocolate. Julia died a few hours after surgery to remove her gallbladder. She'd been returned to her room, her mother was at her side, while her father had gone home to pick up her younger sister, Hannah. Her parents welcomed Gertie and Dan Berg, established the Julia Berg Memorial Lecture at the University of Minnesota Foundation to create an ongoing reminder to medical students and the wider medical community about the consequences of diagnostic error and the need for critical vigilance within the entire care team. And this lecture is a product of their generous support. Welcome Gertie and Berg are here today, and I'd like you to join me in thanking them for the support of this lectureship. In order to create some context for today's talk and to introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Andrew.
Thanks, John, and thank you to all for coming this morning. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce someone who's a real visionary in American healthcare. Dr. Mark Graber is, along with a few other people, really nearly single-handedly responsible for launching the movement of understanding how we make diagnoses, how those diagnostic processes fail, and how that harms patients. Mark's seminal paper in 2005 came out that showed some of the reasons for diagnosis error, and those of us who study patient safety know that Mark's work that showed the interplay between cognitive and systems factors that lead us to make the wrong, missed, or delayed diagnoses are all too common. 10 years ago, Mark, with some others, helped found the Diagnostic Error in Medicine Conference that's been held every year, and now we've just had our 10th one, had over 400 people from around the world. And Mark was also single-handedly, with a few other folks, involved in launching the Institute of Medicine report that came out and really spurred this and got significant national attention on the problem of diagnostic safety in the country. Mark's a nephrologist who practiced his whole career and now focuses on improving diagnostic safety. He's won multiple national awards, has spoken all over the world, most recently in Australia, I believe. And we were delighted that the last couple days we spent here at the University of Minnesota working together for a funded curriculum to improve diagnostic safety in the country. And so we're getting learning objectives together. We actually made some consensus, and we took advantage of Mark being here for that. And so I please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Graber to share his words about improving diagnostic safety.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, John. Sound okay? Can you hear in the back all right? Okay. Well, it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here to honor Julia Berg and her story. Andrew tells me that the folks here are very familiar with that story, and I hope you are, because there's so many lessons that we can all learn. It's also a pleasure to talk to pediatricians, my favorite kind of people. Pediatricians are gentler, kinder folk. I don't know how that happens, but there's this self-selection process that goes on that ends up producing that result. I'm here on behalf of our society to improve diagnosis. We're the only group that's focused on this problem of diagnostic error. Our vision is someday there'll be a world where nobody's harmed by diagnostic error, and it's our belief that diagnosis should be accurate, timely, efficient, and above all, safe. And Andrew recounted kind of the history of where we've come from. Our first conference was in 2008, so we just celebrated our 10th. Our society was formed a couple years later. We now have a journal called Diagnosis, and there are two major projects that we're most proud of. One is to have convinced the Institute of Medicine to put out a report on diagnostic error and what we could do about it. So that's Improving Diagnosis in Healthcare, came out in 2015. And we've just created a group that we call the Coalition to Improve Diagnosis, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along. This is what I'd like to go over today. How likely is it that there will be a diagnostic error? What are the major causes? And that we have to back up a little bit and consider how doctors think. And we'll finish up by considering what are the interventions we could adopt that would make the world a safer place. So I'd like to tell you a different story. This is not Julia's story, but there are many. This happened in my neck of the woods. And it was all over the newspapers in New York. Not because it was a diagnostic error. Those stories hardly ever make the paper. I don't know why. They should. But it was because of Sully. Remember Sully? The plane landed on the Hudson River? So this is a story of Rory Staunton, who was a 12-year-old boy and a very extraordinary child, like Julia. Very distinct, personality. He wasn't doing video games and skateboarding. He was like a man of the world. He had written a letter to the leader of North Korea that he wasn't happy with civil rights there. He had started a campaign in his school about bullying. And when he heard the story of Sully, he just thought that was the greatest thing ever. He wanted to grow up and be a pilot. So he wrote a letter to Sully. Sully had written him back. And it was his plan to grow up and go into aviation. He got for his birthday, 12th birthday, a helicopter ride around New York City. Anyway, Rory's story started at school, at recess. They were out in the playground, and he was diving for a ball and scraped his arm. Actually, his father told us he got the ball. That was the good news. The bad news was he scraped his arm. Didn't think much more about it. 3 nights later, he wakes up from sleep, feels terrible, feverish, he vomits, and the next day can't go to school. He's just so sick. So the family succeeds in getting an appointment at the pediatrician's office, and the pediatrician documents his history of fever and chills and throwing up. His vital signs are kind of striking. Heart rate of 140 is way up there, even for an adolescent. And his skin is described as mottled. So I'm guessing like someday, all doctors will be wearing a camera like the policeman, so we can kind of see all these things, but we don't know exactly what it looked like. This is just a stock picture of mottled skin. We call this livedo reticularis. It's kind of a striking finding when you see it. It's unusual. It's kind of a red flag that there's something serious going on. So the pediatrician documented that. The abdomen was benign, and she's hearing this story of an adolescent child, febrile, throwing up, gastroenteritis. Made a lot of sense as the diagnosis. But she recognized that Rory didn't look good, kind of punked, called up the local emergency room. And this is the emergency room of a hospital that every week in the New York Times says they are the best hospital in the world. Not in the country, in the world. And we'll pick up the story at that point. Same vital signs, same story. The skin exam isn't mentioned at all in the notes from that ER visit. And again, the abdomen's benign. They say, sure, gastroenteritis, and gave him some fluids and some medication for nausea and sent him home. After he left, his blood test came back. And I don't know if it would have changed things or not. His white count was a little bit elevated. Normal's like up to 12. Here he is 14. Not a big thing. But he had 53% bands, which is an indication of a bacterial process going on, not really consistent with viral gastroenteritis. The next day, worse. Can't get off the couch. Parents told us they had never seen anybody's skin look like this. It's all splotchy and red and blue and black. They tried to get back in touch with the pediatrician, did not succeed. Somebody from the office said, just take some Tylenol. The next morning, they couldn't stand it anymore. They brought him back to the emergency room. He's admitted to the ICU, but he dies the very next day of streptococcal sepsis, which is in all likelihood what he had all along. So it's kind of a tragic case of diagnostic error. It wasn't viral gastroenteritis. It was streptococcal sepsis from that scrape on his arm. And I would love to be able to say this is such a rare thing, like Julia's situation. This is such a rare thing, but it's not. These things are happening at every hospital across the country and across the world. So that's what we're here to talk about. Fortunately, everything we know about the field of diagnostic error was summarized in this great report that just came out 2015 from the National Academy. So a lot of what I'm going to say is in there. If you're interested, you can download the report for free, or its summary that's 4 pages long instead of 450 pages. So what do we know about diagnosis? Well, one thing we know for sure is that it's really important. It's important to patients for sure. A survey done by the Kaiser Family Foundation years ago, it's the #1 concern of patients engaging in the healthcare system, the possibility of a diagnostic error. And it's so important to us as physicians. I'm an internist. You're going to be pediatricians, or you are pediatricians. And this business of diagnosis is really foundational. This is who we are. We're supposed to excel in this. This is a quote from Sherwin Nuland. It's the most critical of a physician's skills, every doctor's measure of his abilities, the most important ingredient in our professional self-image. But here's the paradox. It's so important, but we really don't talk about it very much. I think the school here may be an exception because you have Andrew and many other leaders who've been thinking about this for a while. But in most places, doctors go on their daily business of practice. They don't really think about how they're doing. They're just doing it. So we're not talking about it. We're not measuring it. It's kind of a strange situation. We were fortunate, as Andrew just mentioned, to have spent the last 2 days here at the university thinking about what we could do in medical education to improve diagnosis. But those discussions are just getting started. You know, we've been practicing medicine for what? You know, forever, 2,000 years. Why is it just now that we're starting to think about this? It's kind of strange. All right, so we have this glorious report, and the problem is it's sitting on my bookshelf. And I have the fear that it's sitting on the shelf of every hospital in the country, and that's not getting the job done. So if we want to improve diagnosis, it means that healthcare organizations, doctors, patients need to do something a little different to improve the diagnostic process. So that's what this talk is really all about. I'd like to convince everybody here to do just 1 or 2 things a little different, and I think that would help improve the situation and reduce the risk of harm. This is the new definition that was in the report. A diagnostic error is a failure to establish an accurate and timely explanation of the patient's health condition and communicate it to the patient. And you see I've highlighted a couple things here. I've highlighted patient. So there are 4 other definitions out there in the world. None of them are patient-centered. So that's an important feature about this definition. It's all about the patient and getting it right for the patient. I've highlighted accurate. What does accurate mean? It's kind of strange. You'd think we would understand that at this point, but we don't. It used to be enough to say somebody had lung cancer, but now you need to know the genotype to know what the right treatment is. What does timely mean? Another kind of paradox. How long should it take to diagnose sepsis? We don't know. There are no guidelines in medicine for how long it should take to diagnose anything. A friend of ours in England, Olga Kostopoulou, did a systematic review of diagnostic error problems in ambulatory care. So one of the studies she looked at was about anemia. How long do you think it takes to diagnose the cause of iron deficiency anemia in women? So you know they're anemic, you know they're iron deficient. How long does it take to come up with the cause? Would you believe 2 years? How long does it take to document asthma in the record of a child who presents with wheezing in an ambulatory care setting? Would you believe 7 visits? So is this right? Is that what it should be? Well, we really don't know. It's time to start talking about what timely means. And communication is in there. It was very controversial whether that should be part of the definition. A lot of people said that's different, that's separate, it's not part of the process. But I'm glad it's there, because if you study diagnostic errors, it's like every other patient safety breakdown. Communication issues are the #1 thing, the #1 cause at the top of the list. So very important thing to have in there. Okay, let's talk about the incidence. What is the likelihood of diagnostic error? So for those of you in practice, I'd like you to think back about the last 100 patients you saw or your last month on the wards. What would you say is your own rate of diagnostic error? Anybody almost never? Oh, I'm preaching to the choir here. Well, when we got started in this business, most of the hands in the room would go up, almost never. And I was an almost never guy. I said, I'm good. I was well trained. I'm careful. I'm conscientious. And it was hard for me to remember a case of diagnostic error that I had been involved in. Anybody 1%? Any 10%? Oh my goodness. Preaching to the choir. Thank you, Andrew. You paved the way. Okay, now take off your professional hat. Think of yourself as a person, a parent, a family member. Think about you and your family. Does one of these three things apply to you? Can you recall a diagnosis you were given that was wrong? Or a diagnosis that should have been made much earlier? Or is there somebody with a medical condition still symptomatic but hasn't been diagnosed? Meet those criteria. Yeah, it's half the room. And it's a fairly young crowd, so that's very impressive. So that's how often diagnostic error impacts people. It's common. I'll show you some of the research data that goes along with that. This is data from CRICO, which is an insurance company for the Harvard teaching hospitals, but they also collect cases from around the country. So these are all people who filed a malpractice suit. And what are the reasons that people file a malpractice suit? Well, the number one reason, the most cases and the most dollars are from diagnostic errors. And these are some of the other research studies that have been done. Survey, one we just did, the National Patient Safety Foundation just did a survey and found that 1 in 5 people have an experience with a serious medical error. Most of those involved diagnosis. Chart reviews. A colleague of ours, Hardeep Singh, went through primary care charts and tried to understand how often there was a diagnostic error. Hardeep found that 1 in 20 primary care patients will have a diagnostic error every year. Every year, 1 in 20 every year. So if you live to be 60 or 70 or 80 or 90, you multiply that by that 1 in 20 chance, that's why the incidence is so high. The future of this is probably in this standardized patients. So these are like secret shoppers. It's actors that are trained to portray somebody with classical rheumatoid arthritis or chronic obstructive lung disease. You send them out into practices in the real world, and you see how the doctors do. And they do pretty good. They get it right 87% of the time. They get it wrong 13% of the time. So we're kind of thinking that the rate of diagnostic error in primary care, in internal medicine, and in pediatrics is going to end up being 10 to 15%. Kind of a strikingly high number. But the more research that comes out, the more solid that estimate becomes. It's better in the visual specialties, so our radiology and pathology and dermatology colleagues have a slightly easier job. They have to interpret something visually, and they're not perfect. Their error rate in practice, 2, 3, 4, 5% in various studies, but certainly better than ours in frontline primary care. And we don't really know a lot about the medical specialties. I'm guessing it's going to be much lower than it is in primary care, but we have very little data there. So those are the research findings, and this is what it adds up to. From autopsy studies, which are the gold standard, but almost never done in our country anymore, in the United States, 40 to 80,000 deaths a year from diagnostic error. It's just like crazy. That would be in the top 10 causes of death. It's more than motor vehicle accidents. It's more than deaths from breast cancer, more than deaths from AIDS, from terrorism, more than any of those things. It's just crazy high. And in every hospital, if you do the math, there's 5,000 hospitals. So in every hospital, 10 deaths a year attributable to diagnostic error, and patients harmed every day in our clinics and emergency rooms. This is the conclusion from the National Academy report. It's likely that most of us are going to experience at least one diagnostic error in our lifetime, and some of these will have devastating consequences. So there's kind of a discrepancy. A lot of people say, I'm practicing medicine and I don't see that many diagnostic errors. But I'm telling you, it's a fairly common thing. So how do we account for that? And I think this is one reason. There was nothing more powerful than an autopsy, your own patient on an autopsy table, and it's showing you something that you didn't even suspect, or something you thought was there just isn't. It was such a powerful lesson, and nothing's really replaced that. So a big problem we have in medicine today is we don't get that kind of feedback anymore. And there's a tendency to be overconfident in what we do and how we practice and how skillful we are in practice. And there's a wonderful book. If you have a chance, you should read this. There's also a TED Talk. So you can look up the 5-minute TED Talk by Catherine Schultz. And she asked the question, what does it feel like to be wrong? What does it feel like to be wrong? And if you think about that, people say, well, it feels terrible. I don't want to be wrong. I'll be embarrassed. Bad for my reputation. People will think. And yeah, sure. But Catherine says, nope, that's not what it feels like to be wrong. What it feels like to be wrong is exactly what it feels like to be right. Exactly the same thing. Because until somebody proves to you that you're wrong, you think you're right. That's like one of these human nature things. It's the default of the way our mind works. If we don't get feedback otherwise, we think we're doing just fine. And that's one of the big problems in this diagnostic error world. A lot of doctors think they're doing just fine. Where do diagnostic errors happen? This is, again, data from that CRICO study. So the majority, biggest piece of the pie, ambulatory care. It makes sense. That's where most medicine is practiced. Big piece of the pie, inpatient care, emergency room. The emergency room, we call this the petri dish for diagnostic errors, like the worst possible place. Somebody works in the emergency room here. Is it not true? I mean, it's an environment that's a little chaotic. There's a lot of distractions. There's a pressure of time. You don't know the patients as well as you'd like to. They don't know you. It's just not an ideal environment for diagnosis. Okay, why do these happen? What is the cause of diagnostic error? And this is the framework I use. My definition's in the middle there. It's a little different than the National Academy one. To me, it's a diagnosis that's wrong or missed or should have been made much earlier. And the vast majority arise from some breakdown in the diagnostic process. So I missed something on the history. I didn't see one of the lab results, like in the Rory Staunton case. You know, I didn't see that CBC. I should have. I didn't get the right consults, you know, some breakdown in the process. Every once in a while, these things, I call them a no-fault situation, where the patient presents with symptoms that are so nonspecific, you just really have no idea what could be going on, or there's just 100 possibilities. Nobody could figure it out. Or maybe sometimes the patient misleads us on purpose, or they're reluctant to reveal something that would be critical to the diagnosis. And a lot of people say, well, these are not diagnostic errors, but to me, this is the future, or part of the future of medicine. This is how we're going to get better. We will have tests that allow us to figure out what something is, when right now it just seems nonspecific. Or we'll have better ways to follow up with our patients to pick up on things they didn't tell us today, or to make sure they actually got those tests done. So that's why they happen. And thank goodness, the vast majority inconsequential. And I don't know what that fraction is. It's huge. Maybe 99.99% of diagnostic errors are inconsequential. They don't matter. You got better anyway. The treatment I gave you worked, even though I didn't know what you had. Somebody caught it. You know, you saw somebody else the next day. They figured it out. And that's fantastic. I'm so happy. But the problem is there's this tiny, tiny fraction that does result in harm. And if you multiply that tiny, tiny fraction by the tens of millions of diagnoses being rendered every day in our country across all these settings, that's why the incidence ends up being so high. So I'm not here to beat up on doctors or on medicine. I think it's amazing that we get it right 90% of the time. I really do. Because what we're doing is really, really difficult and complicated. I think it's the most difficult cognitive thing that humans do. This is harder than rocket science, much harder. And why? Well, because there's so much variability and complexity amongst all the players and at every step of the diagnostic process. There's variability amongst our patients and how they tell us things. There's variability amongst ourselves. We're not all the same. And we're not the same doctor today that we will be tomorrow or yesterday. If we're sick, or if we don't feel well, if we didn't get enough sleep, it's not the same. All this variability contributes to part of the problem. And how many diseases are there, for goodness sakes? There's like so many. If you look at the ICD system, there are over 12,000 distinct diseases. Or you can use the system that the National Library of Medicine uses, their mesh system. There's over 8,000 diseases. And what's like interesting but also a little scary, you can go to the National Library site and see the 100 or 200 new diseases added every year. So how am I going to be able to diagnose somebody with a condition I've never heard of, which was described last year, and I'm not keeping up with the National Library listing? Illustrating the challenge that lies before us in this diagnostic error story. So if you're trying to understand what's a diagnostic error, I like to use this approach. Here's Rory Staunton or Julia going along their clinical course. There's a diagnostic error, and it's perfectly appropriate to wonder what went wrong in the cognitive domain. So there's always going to be a physician or several physicians or clinicians right there at the sharp end of medicine. And it's the right thing to do. What were you thinking? Why didn't you think of sepsis? Why didn't you think of a viral infection in Julia's case? But the Institute of Medicine would say, you know what, you're wasting your time on Mark. He's never going to make that mistake again. You should worry about the healthcare system, because this is so important in determining how we practice, what resources we have, how good is the communication and coordination of in our healthcare system. And if you can fix something in the system end of things, the blunt end, you've made the world a safer place from now on, which is great. That's what we all want to do. So yes, there is good advice to focus on the system, but as a physician, I'm kind of more interested in the sharp end, because that's where I'm at. That's what's under my control. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about that sharp end. We studied 100 cases of diagnostic error and tried to figure out to what extent is it a system thing or is it a cognitive thing. And the most common situation is there's both going on. But if you ask how often is there a cognitive problem, it's the sum of blue and yellow. So like 3/4 of the time there's a cognitive issue, usually more than one. Or how often is there a system problem, sum of blue and red. So 2/3 of the time there's a system issue. And these are some of the system-related problems that we saw in our cases, and if you're practicing medicine, these will all be really, really familiar to you. You've seen every single one of these things, and they happen not only in relation to diagnostic error, but just patient safety in general. So, you know, lab tests that get lost, medical records aren't available, et cetera, et cetera. You know all these things. A new thing to me was this thing at the bottom, a big term, normalization of deviance. So I didn't know what that was, but I do know now. And I'll give you an example. To be really good at diagnosis, if a patient comes into my ER, I need to do some imaging. And the hospital where I worked was kind of a small hospital. We did not have a radiologist on call at night. Did not. Or on weekends, or on holidays. So if you're a patient, you came to my emergency room with shortness of breath, we could do the x-ray, but it was read by whoever was moonlighting in the emergency room, like the endocrinology fellows reading my chest x-ray. Great. You know, and they got most of the abnormalities, but every year there were 2 or 3 or 4 situations where the real radiologist would come in on Monday and go, whoa, you missed the pneumothorax, you missed this fracture, you missed this, you missed that. And we all knew that that was the case because we couldn't afford a real radiologist. So this is normalization of deviance. You get used to the way things are, even though if you're not happy with that. We knew we couldn't afford that radiologist, and that was just the way it was. So this is one of the things we can all do. When you run across a system problem that's annoying to you, every once in a while you should call it to attention. Maybe we could fix this. And you can't do it every day. You'll drive your boss crazy. You won't be welcome in their office anymore. But once in a while, bring some of these system things to attention. A million of them. You could start anywhere. One of the system problems is breakdown in communication. Remember, that was part of the definition. Here's some examples of what we mean by that. Over half of primary care providers do not have a system to track the tests that they order. They wouldn't know if you didn't have it done or if the result wasn't backed. 8% of critical lab abnormalities, these are not the everyday lab abnormalities, these are the critical ones, are never found. Data from Hardeep Singh. 62% of the tests that are ordered on inpatients but the results don't come back till a few days later after your discharge, the primary care provider is unaware of those. So breakdowns in communication, another very common example of system-related problems. We consider this the low-hanging fruit. Healthcare organizations that are starting to tackle diagnostic error, many of them are starting here. Let's fix some of these breakdowns in communication. Okay, but I'd like to focus on the cognitive things, and this is what we saw. Every once in a while, there was a situation where the doctor hadn't heard of the diagnosis. Okay? One of them was my own cases. It was a patient who had something called Fournier's gangrene. Never heard of it. So the diagnosis was delayed for a week until one of the consultants says, oh, this is Fournier's gangrene. Thank you. I had never heard of that. So it happens, but it's unusual. Sometimes there's a problem with data gathering, as there was in the Rory Staunton case, that CBC should have been available. People are writing a lot about we're not as good doing our physical exams used to be, so we miss a physical finding. So these are fixable things. But you see the biggest chunk of the pie here is in putting everything together, the synthesis phase, where you're doing the clinical reasoning process, trying to figure out what's happening. The vast majority of diagnostic errors arise from problems in that domain. So it gets to this question of how do doctors think? How do we think? There are 2 books on that subject, and I wouldn't recommend either one of them. But what I would recommend are the papers of Arthur Elstein, who was a cognitive scientist in Chicago, and spent his entire career interviewing doctors. He'd give them a scenario to read and ask them to think aloud about how they come up with the diagnosis. And this is how we've learned most of what we know about how doctors think. So Arthur studied this his entire career, and he unfortunately did not solve the question, but he simplified it a little bit for us. Because Arthur's thinking to himself, well, this diagnosis stuff is really important, right? Doctors are going to do a great job with this. They're going to stop and make a differential diagnosis. And they're going to think about all the possibilities and what are the odds of each one and what are the consequences if I miss something. And you know what? That is not what Arthur saw. Hardly ever. This is what he saw. So here's a little scenario. Here's a patient who comes into our clinic. They were cleaning up their yard last week, getting ready for the fall. And now, a week later, they've got this wicked eruption on their exposed part of their legs. And it's vesicles and it's linear arrays. So what does this patient have? Help me out here. Oh, he's an IV. Any dermatologists here? Yeah, never. I've never seen a dermatologist at Grand Rounds. I don't know what's going on with that. It's too busy. Yeah, absolutely, poison ivy. So how do we make that diagnosis even though we're not a dermatologist? Well, we recognize it. And that's what we're talking about with diagnosis. So much of diagnosis is just recognizing what's going on. And it turns out that diagnosis, this is the current paradigm for how doctors make a diagnosis. It's the exact same paradigm for how we all make every decision in life. There's a place in our brain, you can light it up on functional MRI. When you're confronted with a new puzzle, a new situation, a new case to solve, it's the recognition center. And most of the time you recognize what's going on and you know the answer within 200 milliseconds. And this is called System 1. It's our intuition, if you'd like to call it that. It's all these subconscious things that go on in our cognition. And it's terrific. We have the diagnosis. If we don't recognize what's going on, we're kind of in trouble. We don't like those situations. We're uncomfortable because we have to stop and think. Whoa, we don't like to stop and think. We much more prefer to be in that automatic mode. But we can do this, and this is what medical school is all about. When you start off in medical training, you don't recognize anything. It's like learning a new musical instrument or learning a new sport. The first couple times you try and do it, it's just so hard. You have to think about everything. After a while, you get good at it. Next thing you know, it's automatic. You can drive to work for a half hour and not recall one thing about what went on. It's all on autopilot. So what is that thing in the upper left? Tell me. Telephone. Upper right. Can opener. Okay. Lower right. Lower right. I don't know. Got to stop and think, right? It's a can opener too. Lower left. I don't know. Modem. So this is System 1 and System 2. We recognize things or we don't. And we can recognize that telephone, even though none of us had a phone that was quite that ugly, you know? But it has the features of a telephone. So we can recognize it. And that's how diagnosis works too. We recognize the features of what's going on. And we match that up with the things that we've seen before or know about. So the professionals call these the heuristics, all the little ways that our mind works. And when I got into this field, there were 3 heuristics. It's now up to 150, and it's growing very rapidly. You can go to Wikipedia and look up cognitive biases and see this amazing diagram of all the heuristics that our minds use in doing our everyday work. It's just amazing how this is growing and coming into wider understanding. And the professionals would say the way we solve that poison ivy case is by using the availability heuristic. It just means that diagnosis was available to us. It's just right there for us to be able to use. And it's terrific because it's fast, effortless. We didn't have to stop and think. And it's so often correct. And the reason it's correct is because the things we know about are the things that are common. So yeah, it works. But there's a problem. And there's a problem with every single one of these heuristics, and that's why we get into so many diagnostic errors. It's not perfect. When we're using the System 1 story, we're not considering the differential diagnosis. We're not taking the time to do that. Our experience is limited. We may not have seen some of the other things that were on that list of other possibilities. And just because it's available doesn't mean it's correct. We already talked about this. The default of the human mind is to assume that you're right. There's very little correspondence when we think we're sure of something and whether it's actually true or not. So being sure of something doesn't predict whether it's correct or not. Kind of scary. Okay, so quickly, what's more common? R is the first letter of the word or third? First? Third. Wow. The third people are correct, but I chose a first letter when I saw this because my typing exercise was roll over Red Rover. So easy for me to think of words that start with R, a little harder for me to think of words where R is the third letter. But even in this example, there's all sorts of words where R is the third letter. It's 3 or 4 times more common. So I guess what I'm getting around to is trying to convince you that this intuition that we all use is wonderful. It gets us through our everyday lives. It gets us through our clinic day. This is how we make so many diagnoses. But it's not perfect, and we need to be careful using it. And it's kind of a controversial thing to say, because if I'm telling you you can't trust your intuition, you're going to have to spend more time doing diagnosis. Maybe it's going to lead to more tests. I'm a little nervous about that, but I think that's where we're at. So we weren't sure whether this was good advice to give people or not. You know, don't trust your intuition is a scary thing to say. So we did a research study. And this was a study we did in partnership with the American Board of Internal Medicine. So these are all the medicine third-year residents. They're about to go into practice. They're as knowledgeable as they're ever going to be. And when it's all done on the computer, so you can see who goes back and changes their answers or not. So this is the question we're posing. Think about the last test you did, the last multiple choice test. What advice were you given? Do you go back and check the things you're not sure about, or do you just trust your intuition? Trust your intuition? That's the common advice. Go back. Okay, 50-50. So we didn't know. That's why we did this study. You know, is it good to go back or is it not? And this is what we found. So these are 80,000 test questions across the country, all about diagnosis. And sometimes, if you went back, you changed a wrong answer to another wrong answer, it didn't help you, it didn't hurt you. But you were twice as likely, if you go back, to change a wrong answer to a right answer, as vice versa. So going back helped you. You got more questions right. You did better on the test if you went back and checked the things you weren't sure about. And silly me, I hadn't done my homework, but when we finally got around to it, it turns out the same thing has been done a half a dozen times over the last century. These are all high-stakes exams, and it's so unusual in science to be able to replicate anything, but every single study found the exact same thing that we did. You're twice as likely to change a wrong answer to a right answer and improve your scores. So that advice to just trust your intuition and leave it at that is not good advice. At least that's my conclusion from this study. If you have some inkling that something's not quite right, you should trust that instinct and rethink what might be happening. So spinning around for anyone? A little bit? Okay, well, they're not spinning around. It's static images on a static screen, but our mind is doing something with that. And I cannot explain that to you. And yet this is the system we're using to make diagnoses, the system that we don't understand. It's a little scary. Okay, and if you need any more convincing, you have to play this along with me. I'd like everybody to free up your legs. I don't know if you can see, but I'd like you to swing your right leg in a nice, slow circle in front of you. Slow, steady, even. And then make a pointer with your index finger and draw the number 6 in the air. Anything funny happen to your foot? So the vast majority of people born on this planet can't do that. You cannot swing your foot and draw the number 6 in the air. And why? We have no idea. And yet this is the system we're trusting to make these really important, these really critical diagnoses. And the next time somebody tells you how good they are at multitasking, you have them do this little exercise. So how do doctors think? Well, for the most part, we use our intuition, and it works really well, as it does in everyday life, but it's not perfect. And we know so little about how our unconscious mind works, and it's just too important a thing to rely upon, in my opinion, to make a diagnosis. So now you know how doctors think, and we can go back to the Rory Staunton case or Julia's case and try and understand what happened. What were the cognitive things? What were the system things? Well, in the system domain, would have been really nice if those lab results had been back. In my opinion, a big problem was there was a lousy plan for follow-up. If any of you have been to the emergency room lately, you leave with a sheaf of papers, 20, 30 pages long, and God knows what's in there. But if you're sick still the next day, you don't know what to do. And that was the case with Rory Staunton's family. They really didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to re-engage with the healthcare system. And to their credit, the hospital where this happened did a root cause analysis, like we're doing now, and they fixed something in that blunt end. So I'm very thankful that they did that. They said, nobody's leaving our ER anymore until their lab results are back. Yay, glad to see that. And that's going to prevent some diagnostic errors going forward. At the same time, I'm a little disappointed because they viewed this as a one-off event, an oddity. But we're pretty sure these diagnostic errors are happening every day. They didn't set up any system to think about this in any ongoing way, which I think they should have. Okay, and how about cognitively? What went wrong in the Rory Staunton case? Well, everybody knows about sepsis, so knowledge is not a problem. The data collection we've talked about. I think they had enough information to at least consider the diagnosis. But what went wrong here are problems that we see over and over again. We see them here. We see them in Julia's case. Many different situations. They were in the wrong context. So in the Rory Staunton case, vomiting, they're in a GI context. And if you're in a GI context, gastroenteritis is a great diagnosis. Turns out it wasn't a GI case. It was an infectious disease case. In Julia's case, it wasn't gallbladder disease. It was a viral infection. Premature closure, another big term, it means you kind of jump to conclusions too soon. You don't think about what else could be going on. So in the Rory Staunton case, yeah, gastroenteritis. There was no differential diagnosis in that chart. I mentioned Hardeep Singh's studies. In Hardeep's study of diagnostic error, I forget exactly how many cases he looked at, but 80% of the time in cases of diagnostic error, no differential diagnosis in the chart. And you know, I don't know what to make of that. When you go to medical school, we all get very good at making these differential diagnoses, but when we get out into practice, we don't do that anymore. We go right to that one diagnosis. You know, be kind of fun. Look at the next 5 or 10 charts and see, is there a differential diagnosis for a patient who had a new complaint? And just see how many times it's there or it's not there. So premature closure is a problem. And there's a famous paper in our field by George Bordage, who was an educator, and it's titled, "Why Did I Miss the Diagnosis?" And that's the question. And the answer is, I just didn't think of it. And it's so true. And it's true in these cases too. I just didn't think of it. Well, of course not, because you're in this intuitive mode and you're moving on to the next case. You're busy. You know, you just don't think of it. You don't take the time to think of it. Yeah, what is a mountain goat doing up here in the cloud? So if you study aviation disasters or disasters in any field, you see these context errors come up over and over again. Pilot thinks they're at 10,000 feet, they're at 1,000 feet about to plow into the mountain. They think there's no ice on the wings, but there is. They think they have enough gas to get back to the airport, and they don't. These context errors are so common everywhere you look. What's that middle symbol? This is from Pat Crosscarry, a cognitive scientist in our world. Well, sure, it's a B, but it's a 13. So Pat's paper is titled, "Context is Everything." Context is everything. So our first job when we're trying to figure out what's going on is to think about whether we're in the right context. And if you're not in the right context, you will never get the right answer. So is it an alphabet context or a number context? Anybody have a dog? Dog people. Any. Okay. Who went to look at 5 litters? Hold up your hand. Nobody went to look at 5 litters? Of course not. This is how we are as humans. Okay, we go to the shelter, we fall in love with some dog, or we know we want a beagle, and somebody, you know, we go see a litter of beagles, and we fall in love with some puppy. We're done. We are happy. This is how we are as humans. Herbert Simon got the Nobel Prize for this in the field of economics. He called it satisficing. It's a great word. I love it. Satisficing. It means we're happy. The minute we've solved that problem, we are done. We're moving on in life. It's the opposite of optimizing. We don't go look at 5 letters. We don't make a differential diagnosis. We're happy with that first diagnosis with the first puppy. Satisficing, optimizing. So we shouldn't feel bad as physicians that we're practicing like this, because these breakdowns in decision-making happen everywhere. And whatever field you look at, you can find papers and examples of these exact same kinds of cognitive errors. And why? Well, because we're human. And this is how our minds work. And it's the exact same cognitive errors we're making in our everyday lives. It's just that they're playing out in medicine, which is a high-stakes environment. So that's the story. Okay? Where are we? We're at a place where we're pretty good with medicine. We get it right 90% of the time, but that's not where we want to be. What can we do about this? This is what we're doing, our Society to Improve Diagnosis. We've now partnered with 35 organizations. Each of them has agreed to do something with their own membership individually to address diagnostic error, and that's fantastic, because this will now reach tens of thousands of doctors out there. They've also agreed to do something collectively. So we've actually just received a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to start an awareness campaign. Next year, we'll actually be able to do some ads or some outreach or something to make doctors and patients more aware of this problem of diagnostic error and what they can do about it. So I'm telling you, there's a lot of these cognitive breakdowns. What can we do about those? So here are some of the problems on the left. Here's some of the solutions on the right. And any of these things would probably be effective antidotes for all of the things on the left. So we need to practice reflectively to think about what's going on. We need to consider the opposite. Be comprehensive. That may be one of the universal antidotes, making that differential diagnosis. Or just asking the question, what else could this be? This is great advice for doctors and patients. Just ask that one question, what else could this be? It gets you out of that intuitive mindset and starts you thinking about what else might be going on. Stop and think. Makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Well, I don't know. This is, again, scary advice for us in medicine because we don't have a lot of time to stop and think. A paper came out just last week that worldwide, the duration of a primary care visit is 5 minutes on average. In the US, it was better. It was 20 minutes. But it's still, is that enough time? This diagnosis business is so complicated. It takes time. So this is from an amazing book from Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Many of you have seen about this and you know about these concepts. And the question comes up, can we teach people to avoid these cognitive traps? And Kahneman would say, nope, you can't do that. These are hardwired. But you can recognize them. So now that you've heard about these things, or many of you probably already heard about them, it won't prevent you from making a diagnosis, but you'll see that there may have been a cognitive problem somewhere along the process. It's kind of like bad breath. It's easier to recognize in somebody else than yourself. So that's what we're talking about. You can kind of step back and it'll be easier for you to see that there might have been a flaw somewhere. So that's the story there. This is a little mnemonic we have up on the wards in our hospital. So after we're done the case, you take a quick peek at this. Maybe it'll help you think of something else that you hadn't thought about. Checklists, love them. A colleague of ours, John Ely, came up with a set of checklists for primary care. He carries them in his lab coat pocket. Patient comes in with chills. Here's chills, pulls it out. Oh, sepsis, hadn't thought about sepsis. Right there on the list. You can download these from our CITM website, improveddiagnosis.org. There's a link to put them on your smartphone. So I have it on my smartphone. I just click on it, boom. There's John Ely's checklist. Very convenient. And there are some terrific online things now to help with differential diagnosis. I don't have a commercial interest in any of these, but I think they're all fantastic. This is how ISABEL works, just as an example. So you put in the key features in a patient's case, fever, mottled skin, vomiting, that was Rory Staunton, and within less than a second, here's some things to think about. Well, what's the number 3 thing on the list there? Streptococcus infection, which is what he died from. Was ISABEL available at that hospital? No. Would doctors have used it if it was available? Probably not. Doctors think they're swell. They don't need these things. But these are tools that can help us be better. So if we're asking, how do we get from 90% to 95%, using something like this could be a simple thing that we could do. This is a study of ISABEL. So left to their own devices, a pediatric ICU, residents got the diagnosis right 89% of the time. With ISABEL, 92.5%. So you can look at that and say, not much of a difference, Mark, is that statistically significant? It is actually, but yeah, it's a tiny difference. But if you're a parent or if you're a safety person, you look at that and you say, before ISABEL, there's 10 kids at risk for harm, and with ISABEL, it's down to 7 or 8. And I am grateful for that. That's exactly where we are in medicine, I think, today. We're going to get it right 90% of the time. You want to get to 92%? Use something like this. Do something. How about using Google for diagnosis? Anybody do that? Yeah, we all do that, right? Do not do that ever again. No, stop. Google's terrible for diagnosis. It's been studied. The sensitivity is under 60%, and the specificity is 0. The list you get is unordered. It does not correspond to the, how common things are in the real world. Do not use Google. How about getting a second opinion? Yes, get second opinions. Very valuable thing to do. Fresh eyes catch mistakes. They do. And do not bias the person you're getting this. Do not call them up and say, I'm sending over a patient with gastroenteritis. You say, I'm sending over a sick kid. Can you reevaluate them? Because if you mention that term, they're already so biased. We know it works. A second pathologist, second radiologist will detect things that were missed on a predictable basis, 2, 3, 4, 5% of the time. Internal medicine, a second opinion comes up with something totally different, 10, 20% of the time. So this is the advice I have for healthcare organizations. I think healthcare organizations should start by trying to find the cases in their own healthcare setting. So like here, you have the Julia Bird case to learn from. And if every medical center did that, that would just be fantastic because it would be meaningful to them and it would be motivating for them to tackle the problem. We already talked about the importance of fixing some of those system things that are so common. Provide one of these decision support resources. They're not expensive. Better pathways for feedback. This is an interesting thing in medicine. If we discover a diagnostic error, am I going to call up Andrew and tell him, Andrew, I found this diagnostic error that you made? That's a difficult conversation. It doesn't happen. We're not at that place yet in medicine. But it could happen if we just did, like if Andrew gave me permission. If Andrew said, hey, that's how experts get better, by getting good feedback. You need to tell me if you run across a case where the diagnosis changed. And if we all gave each other permission, it'd be a lot easier to have those conversations. Second opinions, make that easier to do. Follow up with patients seen in the ER. I think everybody's doing that. Everybody's getting a call the next day. Are you still okay? What about a second call a week or 2 weeks later? Hey, did we get the diagnosis right? Just to find out how we're doing. There isn't a single healthcare organization in the country right now that's measuring the rate of diagnostic error of their own services. What can we do as doctors? Well, you've seen my advice already. Be thoughtful, be reflective, stop and think. Learn why these things happen. Well, you already know. Make that differential diagnosis, even when you're sure. Even when you're sure. Stop and think for a minute. What else could this be? Make the patient your partner. This is something that's free and wouldn't take that long. But if you encourage patients to be your partner in this way, it's going to be so powerful. Instead of telling them you have gastroenteritis, you say, I think you have gastroenteritis, but if you're not better tomorrow, if things get worse or change, you have to get back to me and we'll rethink it. How powerful is that? That's fantastic. You're creating a safety net by making the patient a partner in the diagnostic process. Get more feedback. That's how experts become so. They get good feedback. And we're all going to be patients someday. Many of us are patients already. So what can we do? You need to be a good historian. You need to take advantage of cancer screening. You have to keep your own medical record. We all think the hospital's got everything. My doctor has everything. They do not. Or at least they don't where I live. Maybe they do here. You have to keep your own records. And you have to speak up. It's awkward. We all want to trust the doctor. And it's amazing that that's the case. And as physicians, we're so appreciative of the fact that patients trust us. But you have to be proactive in your own care. And if something doesn't seem quite right, it's perfectly appropriate and actually a very good idea to raise those concerns. Hey, this doesn't make sense. Why did this happen? Why are we not doing that? And it'll be a little awkward, but you got to do it. And physicians have to get used to patients doing that and accept it and realize that that's a very powerful way to improve diagnosis. So we need to know what to expect, how to follow up. So that's the story. It's a tough problem. There's a lot of harm, but there's a lot of things we could do, and they're not expensive and they're not difficult. So each of us could think about, what could we do tomorrow? What one or two things could I do to help reduce the risk of harm from diagnostic error? And this is the mandate we have from the National Academy. Improving the diagnostic process, not only possible, it's a moral, a professional public health imperative. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Graber. We have time for a few questions, and we're going to use microphones so that people who are listening remotely can hear. Mark, I just have a question for you. You've made a case that diagnostic error leads to harm for patients. And in the two anecdotes you shared, Rory and Julia, the route to harm was very different. In Rory's case, there was an error in diagnosis that led people to not do things they should have. And in Julia's case, there were errors in diagnosis that led people to actively intervene and cause harm. I wonder if in terms of the harm that results from diagnostic error, whether you could comment on the balance between errors of omission and errors of commission.
Oh, interesting question, John. I've never really thought of that. Does anybody have an opinion on that? People say that errors of omission are like 5 or 10 times more common. Doctors are reluctant to commit for fear that they'll do the wrong thing, so they're much more common. Which causes more harm, I'm not sure. Yeah, what do you think? Oh, okay. All right, so we don't know. Good question. Give us 5 years.
Well, thank you for recognizing that the emergency department setting is different than other settings, and but it doesn't really change our expectations. It doesn't matter how busy it is; we still have the same expectations.
Yeah.
But I would like you to comment on the difference between diagnosis and disposition. In Rory's case, the pediatrician didn't get the diagnosis right, but he or she got the disposition right and sent the patient to the emergency department. And what we think is that disposition is sometimes more important than, well, it is at least as important as diagnosis, sometimes more.
Oh, absolutely. But it's just like, I don't know if you'd agree with this or not, to me it's just like diagnosis. You're trying to make sense of the situation, you're trying to figure out what's going on, you're trying to figure out what's the best thing to do. I think it's an exact analogy to the diagnostic process. We do it right, you get it right, 90% of the time, 95, I don't know what the number is you think. It's been studied in cases of chest pain. So the triage decision to send a patient home or admit them for observation is correct 99-point-something% of the time. So we know for that one complaint, you do it really, really well. But outside of that one symptom, I don't know that we have good data, but to me it's the exact same problem as with diagnosis. These exact same things are going to come into play. We're going to use our intuition instead of maybe stopping to think. I don't know, what do you think? Your reaction?
No, I agree. And your points about developing systems help us to not rely on our intuition right away. So Rory comes to our emergency department. His vital signs, he meets SIRS criteria. Our nurses immediately put him right down the sepsis pathway.
Thank you.
And we haven't thought anything other than following our own rules.
Thanks for that. You're absolutely right. This is one of the great things that's happened in medicine. The sepsis is probably the role model for where you can improve diagnosis, and it has improved because of guidelines and sepsis bundles. And these are now in use, widespread use across the country. And it's helping. But that's one diagnosis out of 10,000.
So some of us are in subspecialty areas where our life is unknown diagnosis, where I'm a clinical geneticist, and I deal every day with the fact that I'm not going to get the diagnosis no matter which tools I use or no matter how smart I am. And how do I shade the accepted level of unknown to what is recognizable error in a place where there's inherent mystery, I mean, you talk about 8,000 diagnoses. Most of the things I see don't have an ICD-10 code. I struggle with this all the time because the last thing we want to do is make a wrong diagnosis or miss a diagnosis, just like any other doctor. But it's inherently overwhelming.
So let me ask you this. What do you tell a patient about that you don't know what their diagnosis is?
Well, I have a spiel. How long do you want to? We pretty much tell them that we do the best we can, that they need to come back in a certain amount of time because things change. We may have even done a test that had a negative result, but they have to come back and have that test reinterrogated. So, it's a lot of follow-up is what it is. And so I follow kids over and over and over because sometimes 2 years later I come down and I have the diagnosis.
But it's great that you're telling them that because it's honest and it's all you can do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm asking doctors to do in every other setting. If you're not sure what's going on, just say that. It could be gastroenteritis, but I'm really not sure. And I think if we convey that uncertainty to our patients, it would be a good thing. It's the honest thing. And it would make them appreciate how important it is to do that kind of follow-up. So you can repeat the test, or maybe, it's been described in the literature since I saw you last. Oh, now I know what you have. Thank you, yeah.
Bryce. You commented on the difficulty of giving feedback to peers or even to trainees about diagnostic error. Are there systematic ways that you think feedback can be done other than being open to receiving feedback?
Thank you for that question. There are people who are starting to think about that, but I haven't seen anything in operation yet. So wouldn't it be nice if there was some system where when you're discharged from the hospital, the thoughts at that point were fed back to everybody who touched that patient, and it's usually dozens of clinicians, in clinic and in the emergency room and in this setting and that setting to find out about what happened. But I haven't seen that applied successfully yet anywhere. It'd be fun to come up with something. Andrew is kind of the world's expert on this.
So there is some interesting stuff that's come out of that. That we've done studies across the country, internal medicine residencies, that have looked at feedback from day teams to night teams, where we see a change in diagnosis 40% of the time. And some of that's just refinement, but it's really fundamental that it gets back. In terms of operationalizing, it's difficult but not impossible. There's a recently funded study that's going on at UCSD that's looking to develop a dashboard so that you can see, based on the patients you admit, which ones trigger an unexpected event, so like a transition of care. And then there's another study that's being proposed, hopefully gets funded soon, about systematizing this across systems so that you can, so that rapid cycling feedback is expected and part of the system. So it's coming. It turns out that all barriers to this are logistic, but they're big, but it's doable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. We're at time, so I want to be sure and excuse people I know who have to move on to other responsibilities. I want to thank Dr. Graber for an outstanding and provocative talk, and thank the Berg family once again for their support of the lecture. Thank you.
You have been disconnected from the meeting.